Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Texas. Our forums are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon. The church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue in North Austin. For more information about our forum programs, go to the church website at www.austinuu.org. This morning, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Frank de la Teja speaking, and one of our forum committee members, Eric Hartman, is going to introduce Dr. de la Teja. Eric?
Thank you, Bonnie. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Frank de la Teja. He comes to us from just down the road at Texas State University in San Marcos, where he's a professor of history. And he is one of those writers and teachers on the subject of Texas history whom you are going to encounter if you try to look beyond the stereotypes about this state. He's been educating Texans on these themes for decades now, and I think we'll have a lot to learn from him as he speaks today. He has spent his career delivering this sort of message about the Lone Star State and some of its mythology, and has done it in some interesting capacities. He has been the state historian of Texas. He has been an archivist for the state. He holds his PhD in Latin American history from UT Austin. I think it's fair to say the premier Latin American history program in the United States. This is especially important to me, coming from a background working with public school educators. He's been especially active in promoting the teaching of a broader vision of Texas history in our public schools, with emphasis not just on what he calls the romantic and nationalistic story of Texas in the 19th century, but also on the earlier centuries that shaped the heritage of this state, and on the 20th century and all the streams of immigration and other cultural currents that have contributed to the current diverse character of the state. He exemplifies the diversity in his own way. He came to the United States from Cuba and was raised in New Jersey, came to Texas and to pursue that degree in Latin American history, but found himself working with James Michener while James Michener was writing on the subject of Texas, and learned a great deal from that experience as well. He's been at Texas State teaching history courses since 1991, and I'm really looking forward to finally getting to hear directly from somebody whose name I have kept encountering every time I wanted to learn more about this topic. So thank you very much for being here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank de la Teja. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for sharing a Sunday afternoon just before the big holiday, or at least the big shopping holiday, is upon us. I'm very glad to be here and speaking to you about something that I spend a lot of time talking not just to students about, but as often as I can to teachers, and that is to think about how to teach Texas history in a way that's more useful for the students that they have in front of them, because the place where I'd like to begin is this idea that there is one Texas history. I was told that it was just the facts, and I tried to explain that history isn't the facts, that history is interpretation, that we choose. Historians, if you think about it, think about the possibility or the impossibility of trying to explain everything that ever happened before now. It's impossible, of course. So history is a series of judgment calls by historians to choose from the pieces of history that are available to us because they're the leftovers of the past. So it's kind of a derivation of a derivation. So history is always incomplete. I like to tell students, if you think about that, those tacky velvet pictures of dogs playing poker, all right, that's what history is. it's dogs playing poker, except you don't know what hands they have. You can tell that it's dogs playing poker, right? But you just can't tell what hands they have because pieces are missing. There are always pieces missing. And there is this jigsaw puzzle that historians rearrange according to their needs. So that history taught from a social perspective is different than history taught from an economics perspective, than history taught from a political perspective, even though they're all intertwined. And for a very long time in Texas, for much of the 20th century, after a professional educational system that developed in the late 19th century gained hold here, that Texas history was shaped by and for the needs of a particular segment of the population. And that segment of the population tended to be white. And it made sense that the educational system was geared toward the students that were present in the classrooms of the time, particularly at the higher level, where the vast majority of Mexican Americans never went past the 5th grade. The majority didn't go to school past about the 3rd grade. And if they were migrant workers, they often, until about the middle of the century, rarely went to school at all. It was not meant for black students who were really not catered to. The textbooks that most black schools in the state, not all, but most black schools in the state had, were the cast-offs from the white schools. When they were no longer useful in the white schools, they were given over to the black schools. So the black students weren't given material that was geared toward their reality. It was material that was geared toward that white reality. So the story of Texas that was told then was meant to promote, to expand upon the interests of that white population. They were the ones that were going through high school. They were the ones who were, some of them, not all of them, that were going to go to college. And they were the ones, therefore, who were going to be the leaders, right? We lived in a segregated state for much of the 20th century, something we again forget. There's many people who can still remember white and black water fountains. There are many people who can still remember signs outside of restaurants saying that they won't serve Mexicans. So it's not a far off past. It's still a recent past. We just tend to forget that. And we shouldn't be forgetting that. And so what I try to do is I try to explain to teachers that, and I've tried to explain to the school board and anybody else who will listen, that the materials that we teach with have to reflect the people being taught. Because if black students, if Hispanic students don't see themselves in the books, then what is it saying about their role in this society? It doesn't exist. It's marginal. It's inconsequential. So to continue to teach a story that is a great man's story, that is the story of political and military figures, that makes women essentially the bearers of culture rather than participants in that culture, that excludes from the main storyline the participation of an increasingly larger share of the state's population, is not doing the state much good. Can we see that in action? I would argue that we see that in action through the political marginalization, self-marginalization often, of black and Hispanic communities in the state. Turnout among them is abysmally low. Turnout among whites is bad, but it's even worse in the minority communities. Is that good for some? You betcha. It's certainly good for some people. Is it good for society in general? No, it is not. Because the people who are making the decisions can claim that they got voted into office legitimately. Sure they did. But whose interests are they really representing? They're really representing the interests of the small minority that actually voted them into office. So I like to talk about history as a way of educating people toward the need for a better understanding, not only of their civic responsibilities, but a general understanding of why, if you don't pay attention to the past as from a historical perspective, you wind up in a seriously compromised situation. I won't go as far as saying that those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it, but I will say that those who ignore the past can't think about the future. And what I mean by that is that past experiences are cumulative, just as they are in any other discipline. I don't care if you open a chemistry book, a physics book, a political science book. I don't care what book you open. What's that first chapter? It's the history of that particular science or discipline. It's cumulative. Without Newton, without Einstein, we don't understand the world that we understand today. Without Machiavelli, we don't understand the politics of the 20th century. So we have to learn from history. And what we learn from history should enable us then to deal with the future in an informed way, not out of panic. And I'm afraid that's where we're headed for, panic, because we don't pay attention to history. And in some ways, we do panic. I try not to panic because I see progress. And I try to understand that progress, and then I try to convey that progress, not based on whether one is a conservative or a liberal or not, but generally the progress of inclusion, which is a bad word among some, but I would argue that it's a very important word, because the greater inclusion we have, the more people we have participating in things, the closer we come to the ideal, that constitutional ideal of a more perfect union, which is something that's often lost in defense of the Constitution. People want to make defense of the Constitution retroactive rather than proactive. And the opening words, in order to form a more perfect union. That means two things. One, the union wasn't perfect. And two, it can't be perfect. If you think about it that way, then the inclusion of more people makes it more perfect. But it's not going to make it perfect. We're never going to reach perfection. We're human beings. But we can, and history then does that. So that's a really long introduction to what I want to talk about, which is Texas history, right? And what it has to offer us. And I start by saying that if you went to school in Texas, then you were probably exposed to one of the way that teachers still teach Texas history, and that is through the Six Flags approach. How many of you had the Six Flags of Texas? Yes. And you had a project where you either had to draw the flag or you had to, why did you do that? Because it was a simple organizing principle. The Spanish, the French, the Mexican, the Republic, the statehood, the Confederacy, and then back to the statehood. All right, so easy way to organize things. But a lot gets left out. Stop to think about it. When Spaniards arrived here, they didn't find a vacuum. This place wasn't empty. It was full of a variety of native cultures that went all the way from sedentary, village-dwelling chiefdoms to nomadic hunter-gatherers. They filled every ecological niche in the state. They were forest dwellers. They were plains dwellers. They were subtropical coastal dwellers. It was a very rich human environment that Spaniards, when they arrived, decided didn't meet their definition of civilization. So the Spanish program, based on Western ideals of what civilization meant, and you couldn't have civilization without one very critical feature, and that was Christianity. In the Spanish case, their flavor of Catholic Christianity. So from the very beginning, there were cultural tensions. It wasn't merely political, it wasn't merely economic, they were cultural. Spaniards tried to impose their Western European Christian culture on these various peoples. In some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't. But some of these people proved pretty resilient. and given the limited technological developments of the time, were able to hold their own, particularly when some of these Indian cultures acquired the horse. Once they acquired the horse, they essentially had parity, technological parity, because if you can look at horses as technology. It's a particular form of machine. And once the Indians acquired that technology, they could hold their own. So cultures like the Apache and the Comanche, who arrived, by the way, the Comanches arrive in Texas at the same time the Spaniards do. You don't get Comanches in the San Antonio area until the 1740s. San Antonio's already over 30 years old by the time the first Comanches make their appearance in the San Antonio area. So people were migrating into Texas, even from directions that are very unexpected. The Wichitas. Waco is named for one of the Wichita groups, Huecos, the Spanish version of the name. They didn't arrive in Texas until about the 1740s as well. They didn't cross the Red River. So Indian cultures were here, but they didn't have flags, right? If not, we wouldn't have 6 flags. We'd have 600 flags because we had a variety of Indian groups, none of whom thought of Texas as a place. Texas is an invention of the Western mind, and the definition of Texas has changed over time. But for the Indian people, there wasn't a Texas. So moving along then, the Spaniards arrive, and they arrive because for them Texas is a problem. It's a problem to be solved. It's a problem they never quite solve, but it meets certain needs that the Spaniards have. And that particular need that the Spaniards have is that they have to defend those silver mines in the interior of Mexico. And they want to keep Frenchmen and Englishmen and everybody else as far away from those mines as they possibly can. And what better place to do it than Texas, which is on the way to nowhere, which serves absolutely of no value within the imperial system. So what do we do? We treat Texas as what it is, a defensive frontier border region, which is why the frontier in Texas lasts as long as it does. It lasts so long because the Spanish have no real interest in developing beyond serving as a buffer to keep others away. And it does that for about 100 years. So those people who talk about the Spanish failure in Texas miss the point. Texas was a money pit. It served a defensive need. We don't need to do anything more with it than what we've got there. The French, of course, wanted to get close to those silver mines. They wanted to establish a base of operations on the Gulf Coast so they could reach the silver mines, trade with the people of this, get that silver back to Europe without having to go through Spain. We don't have a lot of time to cover it, but if you get a chance, visit the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum, where there's currently an exhibit in the temporary space. They're reassembling the Belle, one of LaSalle's ships. It sank in Matagorda Bay. And you can see the reconstruction process going on by either visiting the museum or going online and watching it happening in front of your eyes on a daily basis. And what it reminds us is that Texas was, from the 16th century forward, part of the world. It was world history. It had been local history before that, a history that's lost to us because the Indian cultures didn't write. But after the 16th century, Texas history is world history. It's part of the competition of empires. The French go away very quickly because they realize that it's really tough to get near those silver mines. And it's going to cost way too much to do it, and the investment isn't worth it. There's other ways of getting their hands on that Spanish silver. So they turn their attention elsewhere. We don't have time to go into it, but the bottom line is Spain gets to develop Texas as that frontier province throughout the 18th century. And the next challenge to Spain in the Texas area is from the United States after the Louisiana Purchase. As a matter of fact, we owe our eastern border of Texas to Napoleon Bonaparte, because Napoleon Bonaparte got Spain to give Louisiana back to France in 1800. Then when he realized how expensive it would be to reestablish a French empire in North America, he turned around and sold it to the United States in 1803. That's the Louisiana Purchase. And, of course, when the Americans said, well, what is Louisiana? Talleyrand, Napoleon's minister, is said to have told Napoleon that, told the American ambassadors that, you've made a good deal, you'll make the best of it. So sure enough, the Thomas Jefferson administration immediately claimed that Louisiana went all the way to the Rio Grande. And between 1803 and 1819, in the middle of the Mexican War of Independence, throughout the United States War of 1812, Spain and the United States argued over what was Louisiana. They finally settled it in 1819, and when they did, the easternmost part of what had been Spanish claims in Texas wound up on the Louisiana side of the border. So if you would like to visit the first capital of Texas, a place called Los Adayes, go to a Louisiana State Historical Site outside of Robeline in western Louisiana. It was Texas up until 1819. It was part of Spanish Texas until 1819. What does that tell us? It tells us that Texas is not only part of this world, but also within North America from a very early date, much earlier than most people think. It isn't Stephen F. Austin who brings the United States to Texas. It was already here in the 1790s, early 1800s. Those cultural interactions are taking place. Already, Afro-Americans, African Americans from the southern United States, from Louisiana, are moving into Texas, escaping slavery. It's one of the great ironies of the competition between Spain and its European rivals, that Spain had slavery. Spain was certainly guilty of importing millions of Africans to perform unfree labor in the New World. But because of its struggles against England and the United States afterwards, if a slave from an English colony and later from the United States escaped into Spanish territory, he was entitled to his freedom. So Texas is a multicultural society from very early on. It's got this Indian stream, it's got this Spanish stream, it's got these French and American streams, it's got this African stream. The interesting thing is that the way that Texas history began to be taught in the 19th century, late 19th century, and then reinforced in the 20th century, is that we dismissed that earlier history in favor of telling the story of Anglo-American settlement that began in 1821 with Stephen F. Austin. What had come before that was considered largely irrelevant. And the story then takes off. I like to kid around that it's like the story of the Alamo. We all know that the Alamo was built by Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie so that they could defend it from the Mexicans. The fact that people don't pay attention to the fact that it had been there for 100 years before that. It was only about, 15, 20 years ago that the Daughters of the Republic of Texas revamped their interpretation of the place and put up these plaques. I don't know if you've been to the Alamo lately. There are now these historical plaques outside the building that tell the entire story from 1718 all the way through the 20th century. A recent development. A development in thinking even within the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and you can tell by their name what they are charged with promoting, right? That the story's bigger than the way it had been traditionally taught. So we move along into the 1820s, and what do we get? We get new people coming to Texas. Very interesting, because again, it's not what you think it is. It's not just American frontiersmen who are moving westward. It's also Irish families. It's also new Mexican immigrants. Martín de León, who is the founder of Victoria, Texas, is bringing families from Tamaulipas and Coahuila and Nuevo León. And that process actually gathers steam at the end of the Republic period, when large numbers of Germans migrate into Texas. So think about how multicultural Texas is when it is receiving European immigrants directly. There was a great exhibit at the Bullock a few years ago. It's traveled since then, which talks about Galveston being the Ellis Island of the West. At the Mexican War, we increased the Mexican population of Texas tenfold by conquering what Thomas Jefferson could never get his hands on, which was the territory to the Rio Grande. Because what the United States gave up in the Treaty of 1819, which said that the border between Texas and the United States was along the Sabine and then the Red River, at annexation and then the Mexican War that followed by 1848, The United States and Mexico have settled those land claims, and guess what? The United States goes to the Rio Grande. And the Mexican populations of the lower Rio Grande Valley and far west Texas in the El Paso area are incorporated into Texas. So we go from a population of about 4,000 Tejanos to a population of about 40,000 Tejanos, because the vast majority of the Hispanic population lived in far south and far west Texas. They are a decreasing percentage of the population precisely because Texas is seeing so much immigration from so many places. And there's even a boom in the African American population at the time of the Civil War. Slave owners in the East, concerned about the federal armies invading, capturing, and setting their slaves free, are bringing them by the tens of thousands into Texas during the period of the Civil War. So there's a tremendous boom in the African American population in Texas during that period of time. So much so that by the end of the Civil War, there's about over 160,000 African Americans in Texas. Does this diverse population have characteristics? You bet. I'll only talk about one: geography. You used to be able to drive in this state and go from Hispanic areas to Anglo areas to black cultural areas very distinctly. The vast majority of Mexican Americans were concentrated along South Texas, and the vast majority of African Americans were concentrated in East Texas, and the vast white spaces, if you will, of Texas ranged in the center and out to the west. It's become fuzzier now with modern urbanization and the creation of these modern enclaves that are very diverse. But up until the 1960s, it was very, very clear-cut. But the interesting thing about this is that even in the midst of those places, there were also other diverse cultural places. Places that still exist and that are now actively promoting themselves that way. Schulenburg and Shiner and Fredericksburg. Panna Maria. There are Polish. There's in Italy, Texas, right? There are places where these cultural European enclaves came and were able to set themselves up. Heck, out in the Panhandle, there were communities of Russian Germans, the descendants of Germans who were brought to Russia during the time of Catherine the Great, and then in the 19th century immigrated to the United States, and it was too cold in Nebraska, so they moved south. So they moved south into Texas. Texas is a diverse place. But you wouldn't know it from the way the history books taught it. So, are we surprised that we see these? Why should we be afraid of the immigration that's going on today, when Texas was built on all of this immigration, all this cultural diversity in the past? It doesn't make much sense, does it? The Asian migration into Texas today, the Central American and Mexican migration that's taken place, the Middle Eastern migration that's taking place today, they are nothing new. Texas has always been a land of immigrants, even Indian immigrants. The most famous Indian Texans, the Comanches, were immigrants to Texas. They didn't start out here. So I want to stop there and open it up for questions, because I probably even went over my time a little bit. No, I'm about right. I'm about right on target. Yeah.
What an exciting talk. Let's take some questions. Raise your hands high. Okay, would you stand and say your name, please?
Hi, my name is Carl Webb. I was wondering, recently at the Capitol, there's been some controversy with the State Board of Education talking about changes in textbooks and curriculum. And I mean, it's wonderful that kids in college at San Marcos can have you, but are you finding that students are unprepared when they get to college for courses like yours?
That's a really good question, and I have to answer that yes, they are unprepared, but they are unprepared for just about everything. So I'm not surprised. We don't teach. We don't market, to put it in modern parlance. We don't market history very well. We tell students from the time they're in grade school that history is just names and dates, and they're supposed to learn it because this is what they're supposed to learn. We don't give them a good rationale for why they should be learning these things. We don't explain the value of understanding the world from a historical perspective. We just tell them that if you're an American, you need to know these things. And really, what we're telling them is you need to know these things so you can pass a test, so that you can move on. So internalizing the kinds of things that I'm talking about today doesn't take place very often. And the problem is, in part, that we don't, as a society, value history as much as we should. We value it for story purposes, so we can make good miniseries out of them, and every once in a while a good historical novel comes out and whatnot. But we don't value it for how it can help us to relate to each other, and how it can help us understand where we've been so that we can have better mechanisms for coping with the future. So we don't value it that way. And the kids smell that. The way they smell fear, right? New teachers going into a classroom, the kids got it all over you because they can smell that you're afraid of them. Well, the kids can smell that history doesn't mean very much in the great big scheme of things. And in fact, at the 7th grade level, I've often kidded, and teachers are horrified, and I am too, because I'm only kidding, that what the best thing the State Board of Education could do, or the state legislature could do, is mandate a Texas history test at the end of the year. Because then Texas history would be taken much more seriously than it is. It isn't taken seriously. There's no test. There's no end-of-course test at the 7th grade level. The first time that happens in a meaningful way is at the 8th grade level with the first part of U.S. history. So where does the State Board of Education come in? I'll make it real simple. They are a political body. They are 15 elected individuals. What do politicians do? How do politicians operate? Politicians horse trade. Politicians negotiate. Politicians play give and take. I would argue that that's not a good way of coming up with any curriculum. If curriculum were designed by educators and by content experts, and all that the State Board of Education did was say, yes, this is solid curriculum, or no, you need to go back and work on this, it would be great. But instead, the State Board of Education takes it upon itself to actually say what's in the curriculum. And once you start horse trading, once you start that political process, I'll give you 2 liberals for 3 conservatives. Okay? I want 3 examples of women. I want 2 examples of left-handed basketball players. They can say whatever they want. Because at the end of the day, they're politicians. And they're answering to their constituencies. They're answering to the lobbyists. And believe me, they get lobbied. They get lobbied by groups. I won't go into any specifics here. You can contact me separately. I'll let you know exactly. I'll give you a couple of specific examples. But they get contacted by groups who say, we want this in the curriculum. And by gosh, if it isn't in the next set of revisions. Those are the problems we deal with. And so that's why the process is not what it should be. Is the curriculum better than it used to be? Absolutely. This round, there are improvements. Unfortunately, it's an unteachable curriculum because the history curriculum is just way too dense. There's just way too many demands. And publishers are in the business of making money. So are they going to produce the best possible book? No. They are going to produce the book that will get past the State Board of Education certification process so they can try to sell it. That's the bottom line. Sorry.
We have a question from Russell Eskew. Russell?
Thank you. I am of Indian heritage, and the only history of Indians that I've ever encountered is there at the Texas State Historical Museum. Any way to promote Indian heritage?
Oh, thank you for asking that question, because it actually brings up something. I was on the original content development team for the museum, and one of the things that the State Preservation Board at the time, we got the message, those of us, the small group that was doing the content development, were told is that we really didn't need to bother with the Indians because that wasn't history. But a couple of us on the team thought, it's not a good way to start. So we have to get the Indians in there. So we had to argue that, in fact, you couldn't understand what the Spanish are doing there, or how the French, what happens with the French in Texas, if you don't deal with and how are you going to tell the story of Americans coming into Texas? Who are they confronting in Texas? They're confronting Indians. So you really have to be able to explain Indians at least enough to make them the foils of Europeans and Euro-Americans. So we made a good enough argument that we got it in there. There will be an even better representation of that native Texas in the revisions that are being done over the next couple of years. The whole first floor is being redesigned, reconceptualized, and the Indian world will be even better represented the next time around. The State Board of the State Preservation Board has come around quite a bit. They're going to let us do things. I keep saying, they're going to let us do that? And the answer so far is yes. So I have my hopes that the next iteration of the museum, again, it won't be perfect, it will not satisfy a lot of people, but it will do a much better job than this one did. And of course, this one, at least at the beginning, when you walk in the door, you see that there's another part of the story of Texas that often doesn't get told.
We have a question from Kent Stewart.
Sir, I've enjoyed your lecture. Would you discuss the immigration caused by air conditioning? Because I'm one of the people that came here because of that.
That's a very interesting comment. Air conditioning is obviously we wouldn't have the cities that we have if it wasn't for air conditioning. But by the same token, we wouldn't have the cities that we have if it wasn't for a whole constellation of technological changes that allowed Texas to communicate with the world. If you think about it, the Texas rivers aren't navigable for very far upstream. So, except for a real coastal fringe, there's not much of Texas, including where we are today, that's easily accessible to the outside world. So it's railroads, and then it's the internal combustion engine, and then it's telecommunication. It's all these it's this constellation of technological changes, part of which is the air conditioning, which made the development beginning in the 1920s, really. The first air-conditioned skyscraper in San Antonio dates from the 1820s. It's the changes that are taking place, and they're all in place. If you really, all the basics, even of telecommunications, it's all in place by about 1945, by the end of World War II, that allow Texas to be what it is today. So you're here in part because of air conditioning, but you're also here because you can get in and out easily. You're also here because you have access to the outside world in a very convenient way. You're here because there is an economic set of circumstances that allow you to live here comfortably. So air conditioning is an important one, but it's only, if it was just air conditioning, there still wouldn't be a lot of people here. Because there wouldn't be, the economy wouldn't have been able to develop as well as it has. Well, maybe we can talk about that one later, because I don't think air conditioning. Do you mean Northerners? I'm kind of at a loss. Northerners, actually, I could have talked about Northerners, but I don't usually consider them an ethnic group. Although maybe we are. The Northerners had actually been coming to Texas from early on. If you look at the North Texas counties, even around by the time of the Civil War, some of those counties voted against secession. Why did they vote against secession? Because they were populated by people from the Upper South and the Midwest. And signers of the Declaration of Texas Declaration of Independence. There are signers there from back east. People who died at the Alamo. I keep saying there was a guy there from New Jersey. There were people from New York and Massachusetts. David G. Burnett, who was the first interim president of the Republic, born in New Jersey. Certainly more came, but people have been coming from all over the country. In the immediate post-Civil War period, blacks continued to come to Texas because they could get their hands. Texas had the highest rate of black land ownership by 1930 of any southern state. So it's a very interesting, complex set of processes. Yes, sir.
We have a question from Fred Higgins.
Yes, Doctor. I'm just wondering, first of all, what you think of James Michener's novel, Texas. And second, would we all benefit, or would Texas benefit if it became required reading for every high school graduate?
Boy, that's a loaded question. Jim was a great guy, and he did some very good, interesting, popular work. I don't think that Texas rises to the level of his best. He was older by then, and he was much more concerned with feeding his core readership, and he had developed certain formula that he employed, all of which are very apparent in the book. So I don't think it's his best work. I think it can be enjoyed by people who like reading Michener, and certainly there are some things to be learned from it in terms of he uses the device of a committee that's trying to understand the Texas curriculum so that they can improve it as his mechanism for setting up each chapter. But unfortunately, it also has a number of stereotypes, and he doesn't challenge those stereotypes very much. So he includes a very broad cast of characters, but he doesn't dispel he doesn't dispel the Texas mythology enough, in my opinion. So, if you enjoy Michener, you'll enjoy Texas. If you don't, you might have trouble with it. And I don't think that our... by the way, anybody under 40 years old doesn't know who James Michener was anyway. It's very depressing for me. Because I can no longer tell students about James Michener, and they would go, oh, in 1991 I could still say James Michener, but now I cannot say James Michener. They just don't know who that is. So that we have that additional problem.
We have a question. Would you say your name, please?
Tomas Rodriguez, thank you for being here. Question, I know you're in San Marcos, and right. I'm curious as to whether your students are doing research in terms of exclusive legislation we continue to have. I'm thinking in terms of poll tax. It was something my family was really, really upset about way back then. But if you look now at Red McComb's program that went through the legislature on tax loans, for delinquent tax loans, and the kind of barbaric things that they're doing with that. And there's so many more that are right at the Capitol now and have been since the Constitution was created in the U.S.
Well, I'm a historian, so the students that I have are actually dealing with issues from the 20th century, which is now the century behind us. And so we don't quite get into the contemporary issues in the history department. Certainly those are the kinds of things that are being studied over in sociology, and they're being studied in political science, and there are many other departments at the university are studying those issues, and my colleagues continue to get in trouble with the politicians for saying things that the politicians don't like to hear, which is why they get branded in ways that I think certainly don't reflect the way I see my colleagues. And the problem is, again, I think in part what I see as in the legislature now, an effort to protect and defend. You see it on most Texas politicians who won saying the similar kinds of things, that we're protecting Texas autonomy, Texas independence, that Texas go at it alone. But it was never that way. Without the United States Army, Indians still control half of Texas today. The Texas Rangers certainly played a role, but the Texas Rangers on their own weren't going to be able to push the Indians out. So the United States Army at one point around the time just before the Civil War had 1/3 of the United States Army was stationed in Texas. After the Civil War, significant United States forces helped to clear the final autonomous Indian groups from Texas. Texas had a policy of what today in the world, in parts of Europe and Asia, we're calling it ethnic cleansing. Well, that's essentially what was happened. It didn't rise to the level of genocide. We weren't out to, although some people did call for the extermination of Indians. The Indians were not exterminated, but they were expelled. They were ethnically cleansed from Texas. It's the only way to describe that process. Where are the Texas Indians today? The Texas Indians today are living in Oklahoma. They're living in New Mexico. There is a small group of Alabama Cashadas who were immigrant Indians who arrived in Texas at the beginning of the 19th century. There is a small group of Kickapoos, also 19th century immigrants from the Midwest, who actually had migrated through Texas into northern Mexico, came back into Texas after the Civil War, were hired by the United States Army to help scout against other Indians. It's a complicated story. It's a complex story, and unfortunately, our politicians and our social media and our media in general has turned it into a series of platitudes and myths that don't help us really cope with the issues. This go at it alone. The United States government, the federal government, spends more money in Texas every year than Texas does. Now, it's your tax dollars, as your income tax dollars. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't your money, but it's the federal government that's spending more money in Texas than the state government does. What does that say about the relationship between the state and the federal government, about who should be doing what for whom? Anyway, we could go down the list of myths, and I could dispel most of them very easily. And I'll just give you one other, for instance, this whole notion that Texas can somehow leave the Union. And the answer is no. And Texas really can't subdivide. I mean, any state can really subdivide if the voters in that state approve it and then the Congress accepts it. Any state can subdivide. We can subdivide too. But can we subdivide based on the Compromise of 1850? No, because what happened? The Civil War came along, and Texas was on the losing side of the Civil War, and then to be readmitted into the Union under radical Reconstruction, Congress had to accept Texas's new Constitution. So the Constitution that was accepted, the 1869 Constitution, did not in any way, shape, or form give Texas the permission to secede in the future, and it didn't give Texas permission to subdivide on its own. And well, I can do the flag too. The flag, that's another easy one. Somehow the Texas flag can fly above the United States flag? No. The Texas flag can be bigger than the United States flag? No. Misconceptions. There is a federal law governing the use of the United States flag, and there's nothing about Texas in it. It can be a guess, right? How dare it not refer to the Texas flag? These are the kinds of things that don't serve us very well. Continuing these myths do not serve us very well.
We have a question here.
I'm Shirley Weiler. Thanks for reminding me why I started out as a history major. I love your enthusiasm. I came a little bit late, and this may have already been stated, but have you written a book on the real Texas history?
The real Texas history. There's no such thing.
Real Texas
There's my
history?
version.
Okay.
I write mostly on colonial and through Republic period Texas.
Okay.
So my books have covered early San Antonio history. They've covered the Revolution and the Republic period. My latest one that I did with a friend of mine is a critical edition of Antonio Menchaca's memoirs. By the way, this is a plug for retired State District Judge Bob Perkins, who has undertaken a mission to get the name corrected on all the street signs in South Austin. It's Menchaca, not Manchaca. So he's working at that. And then I do have a textbook that two colleagues and I have collaborated on. It's called Texas Crossroads of North America, and it's about to go into a second edition. So it's got our version of the history there.
And one other quick question. I'm really puzzled, upset about the Middle East. Is there any good historical perspective on how we got in such a mess?
I'm going to let you bring someone else in to talk about the Middle East. All I can say is that it's one of those historical lessons that we haven't learned. Going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, when we created after the First World War, when we created or helped create the League of Nations, we decided that we needed a new imperial order in the Middle East. So we took away Palestine and that whole area. We took it away from the Ottomans, from the Turks, because we broke up the Ottoman Empire, or the last remains of the Ottoman Empire. And we decided that those people can't govern themselves. They're not civilized enough. So we need to give the area to the French and the English, which we did. And so in Palestine, we created what was called the Palestinian Mandate, where the British came in and ruled Palestine. And what they did is they got together with Zionists who had been trying to establish a homeland for Jews from about the middle of the 19th century, and we reinforced that relationship to the detriment of the local Palestinian population, and regardless of whether it was Christian or Muslim or anything else. We supported the British as they supported the development of this pro-Zionist attitude in the area, and so we laid the seeds of the current problem by continuing to support imperialist behaviors. The United States supported the imperialist behavior of the British and the French in the area in the early 20th century, and those chickens have come home to roost in.
Let's get in one last question. Douglas Bauer.
Could you comment on the impact of the universities in Texas, UT, Texas State, etc., on multicultural Texas? It's a huge question.
Well, yeah, it is a huge question. I'll give you a short answer, which is that the universities in Texas are becoming more diverse. They're becoming more multicultural. And the reason they're doing that is because they're getting an influx of more diverse students. University faculty are producing all kinds of work that demonstrate that diversity, but it doesn't get translated into the popular imagination, because the popular imagination is trapped in this mythical way of representing Texas, which is very useful. It's useful for it's useful for the beer makers. It's useful for the car. Have you noticed that every single car company has a Texas edition of whatever. All right. It's useful for all of these purposes. There's banks and anything. I'm driving in. Where was I? Just the other day in Dallas, and I'm driving behind this Alamo cab company in Dallas. Alamo. So there are certain trigger words. There's an iconography, and there is a jargon that is Texan, and it's very useful for a whole set of uses that makes it difficult to penetrate the mind, the intellect of the Texas population with the idea that it isn't quite the way it's being represented. I'll leave it there. But it is happening on the college campuses, so I have hope.
Nick, how many minutes do we have? 3. Would you like to take about 2.5, 3 minutes to wrap up for us?
Okay. Well, thank you again for coming this afternoon and for sitting there and listening patiently. And who am I to tell you what you should think about your own state, other than perhaps helping you to think about some things that you may not have thought about in a while, or helping you to think about things in ways different from the way you normally think about them. And I do want to emphasize that I remain hopeful that we can move forward. One of the interesting things is that even the most conservative of politicians don't really want to return to the world of the 1950s, even if they don't understand why. But the world of the 1950s was a world in which there were still black and white water fountains. It was still a world where the University of Texas didn't have a single player of color on any of its teams, because it had only been a couple of years since they actually even admitted students of color. It's a world that has moved beyond that old way of thinking about things, and we need to have that history that is taught in the schools also move beyond those tropes. And to the degree that the new curriculum does a little bit better job of doing that, it helps us move away from those things, to that degree we'll get improvement. So I remain hopeful that we can make progress consistently, if evolutionally rather than revolutionally.
Let's thank Dr. De La Teja. Thank you.